Let me introduce Professor Boneh. It's my pleasure to introduce him. He heads the Applied Cryptography Group here at Stanford, and he also co-directs the Computer Security Lab. His research focuses on the applications of cryptography to computer security. And he's not just a researcher, he's also a very innovative educator. He is the co-director of Stanford's Advanced Cybersecurity Professional Program, which is an online self-paced program, as well as our online cybersecurity graduate program, which is taking on-campus graduate classes and making them available to remote learners. He also has a MOOC on cryptography, and he has co-written a free online textbook on applied cryptography. So if you like what you see here, there are a lot more places to hear Dan talk. And I should say he's done quite a few webinars with us. And so there's a webinar on the same topic from about 3 years ago. Interesting to see side by side what has changed, as well as on other topics. So with that, Dan, I'm going to hand the reins over to you.
So I'm not sure what everybody's backgrounds are. And so I thought, this would be more of a kind of a high level talk about what's happening in the blockchain space. As I said, if you want to kind of get into more details, feel free to sign up to any of our classes. And that's where we get into a lot more detail than I have time for here. But let's start from zero. Let's start at the beginning, and then we'll go deeper. So what is a blockchain? So to me, the abstract answer for what a blockchain provides is basically it provides coordination. Yeah, it's a way to basically, for many distrusting parties to coordinate with one another without a single trusted party. Yeah, so in financial applications, we can coordinate and run a financial system, even though we don't trust one another. And there, as we see in just a minute, there are many other areas where blockchains apply. One thing that I want to caution everybody is that because the blockchain area seems to be like a pretty popular area, there's I've seen a lot of attempts to sort of use blockchains in environments where they're not the best solution. So what I want you to keep in mind is really that if any environment that already has a trusted party that all the participants actually are happy to trust with their data, in that case, there's no need for a blockchain, right? In that case, there are many centralized systems that are much simpler and cheaper to run, so you might as well use one of those. Yeah, so this is kind of an important thing to remember. I mean, I've seen people try to use blockchains in environments, where maybe there are easier solutions. So, let's focus on applications of blockchains where they really do make sense. And of course, in a financial system, there's usually not a trusted party. Nobody trusts anyone in finance. And so that's actually where blockchains kind of shine. So again, just sticking with a high level for just a little bit. So in my mind, a blockchain is sort of made up of 4 different components. I used to call them layers, but the word layer is used for something else in the world of blockchain. So I'll just call them components. Yeah, so there's the consensus component. This is just to make sure it's like a ground layer, just to make sure everybody's agreeing on all the data that's on the blockchain. Yeah, so it's not possible that one person sees one set of transactions on the chain and another person sees another set of transactions on the chain. And that property should hold for all but the very last set of transactions that were added to the chain. So there's consensus in that we all agree on what is on the blockchain. And also the blockchain has to be live in the sense that anyone can always add more transactions to the chain. So there's a lot to say about consensus. That's not what I wanted to talk about today. So we'll move on. Above consensus sits what I call the compute layer. Sometimes this is called a blockchain computer. And this is basically a virtual machine on top of which people can run applications. Yeah, once we have a consensus layer where everybody agrees on what the data is, we can start talking about computations on top of this data. Yeah, and the way to do that is using the blockchain computer, which is what I would call the compute component or compute layer. Typically, these together form the core of a blockchain, right? If you think of Ethereum, there's a consensus component and there's a compute component, namely the EVM. If you think of Bitcoin, there's a consensus component, and then there's a bit of a primitive compute component that is the Bitcoin scripting language. And the same is true for many other blockchains. Once we have these 2 components, consensus and compute, we can start writing applications on top of the blockchain computer. Those are called decentralized applications or dApps, and they can do a whole bunch of different things, as we'll see in just a minute. And finally, the last component is basically the component that interacts with the actual user. So these are typically systems that run in the cloud, just a regular cloud. They take instructions, commands from the end user, and they communicate those commands to the dApp and vice versa. Yeah, so those are, to me, those are kind of the 4 components that make up a blockchain. And there's a lot of activity happening in all four. It's really such an active area that I can tell you also, as Pac said, we've been running this blockchain program now for a while. I can tell you that teaching a blockchain class is one of the hardest things in the world, because literally the entire class has to change from year to year. It's very different from teaching calculus, where you're teaching the same thing over and over. There's so much activity in the blockchain space that we kind of have to redo the class almost from scratch every year. It's really quite remarkable, and it's actually what makes it so much fun to teach. Maybe I'll go through this quickly. Just I wanted to show you one more time kind of the picture of how these blockchain applications are built, right? So they're all built on top of the consensus layer. There is all these applications, the dApps running inside of on top of a blockchain computer. They all maintain state that's stored on the blockchain. For example, what is everybody's balances, right? That's state that's maintained on top of the blockchain. And then the end user actually interacts with these cloud servers. The cloud servers themselves have a database that replicates often the data that's stored on the chain. And then these servers are the ones that actually interact with the blockchain itself. Of course, if the user wanted to, the user could interact directly with the blockchain. That's done through, there are many end user type programs that will interact directly with the blockchain without going through a cloud service. But typically, there will be some sort of a cloud service that presents information to users, and that's the thing that interacts with the chain. Okay, so this is kind of at a high level how these systems operate. And so now we can kind of start with what I wanted to talk about. So first of all, I wanted to kind of make sure everybody's kind of aware of all the application domains where blockchains have been used so far. So primarily, they started with financial applications because, again, that's an environment where nobody trusts. Well, typically, there's no trusted party. So DeFi applications make a lot of sense for blockchains. But over the years, we've actually come up with a couple of other areas where blockchains are a very good fit. So one of them are what are called NFTs, or non-fungible assets. So things like art, sports cards, things like that. And there are services like NBA Top Shot, where you can buy or you can own videos of your favorite athletes, OpenSea, where you can buy art, Foundation, where you can buy art, and so on. And again, the exercise you always have to go through is ask yourself, why is it that we want to record art ownership on the blockchain? Why can't we just use a centralized system that says who owns what? And the answer actually is quite simple. If we had a centralized system that recorded who owns what art, if that centralized system either got hacked or it got corrupted, or maybe just went out of business and the database disappeared, the ownership information would kind of be gone with it. Yeah. And so storing ownership information that has to live for, potentially, decades or maybe even centuries, like ownership of art, which might, propagate through generations, we want to make sure that that's stored in an area that can, on a system that can never go out of business and basically die. And a blockchain is a wonderful way to do this. My personal belief is the blockchains we're building today are going to be with us forever now. Yeah, so information that we put on Ethereum, information we put on the Bitcoin blockchain, it's likely, well, I'll support Ethereum more for that, but most likely the information we put there will stay with humanity now for decades, if not centuries. And so in that sense, this is a very good match as an application, because we can record ownership of those things, long-term things, and basically ownership cannot change unless the owner of the piece of art decides to give it away. It turns out we've seen other domains where this type of property is useful too. For example, in gaming, right? There are a number of games now that are being played on blockchains. And again, gaming assets, in some sense, follow the same rules as art, in that, if I own a particular, sword in a game, or if I own a particular skin in a game, I want to record that I am the owner of that, and no one should be able to take it away from me unless I give permission. So again, it makes a lot of sense to store gaming information on a blockchain as well. We're actually seeing a lot of that. And moreover, we're actually seeing games being played on a blockchain. And again, all the revenue and benefits and assets that are being generated by the game are all recorded on a blockchain. So that information will stay there forever and cannot be changed without the owner's consent. And the fourth area that I wanted to mention, which is, again, very exciting, I think, is the area of decentralized organizations, what are called DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. And so, as you know, these DAOs are basically used for investment. So, a group of people can get together, establish a DAO, everybody contributes funds to the DAO, and then the community as a whole makes investment decisions, right? So this is kind of a modern investment bank where the community decides how to invest the assets stored in the DAO, and there are a couple of very large DAOs that are quite successful in doing that. There are DAOs for donations, for charity. There are DAOs for collecting art, like Pleasure DAO. Pleaser DAO is a well-known DAO for collecting art, and so on. What's interesting is it's actually quite easy to create DAOs. There are many tools out there that will let you create a DAO with whatever rules you want. Syndicate is one example, but there are many other tools out there that will let you create and manage DAOs. So this is something that you can literally go out this afternoon and play with. Go ahead and create a DAO, invite your friends to join it. And if you have a cool idea for what you guys want to do together, that could all be done through a governance process that you and your community kind of does together. So lots of successful DAOs out there today, and this is another area where blockchains really kind of shine. Okay, so those are kind of the current application domains where blockchains are used. I hope there'll be more in the future. Yeah, the more, the better. But these four are kind of right now where much of the action takes place. I guess I quickly want to just remind people in the DeFi space, again, I imagine many of the people who are watching know this, so maybe I can go through this very quickly. But in the DeFi space, there are a lot of experiments going on. Yes, so just to call out a few, Compound is a very successful lending platform. I guess Uniswap is a very successful online exchange that allows you to change one asset for another, all being done on the blockchain. There are custodial services for managing your assets. And finally, I'll mention stablecoins, which is, again, a beautiful, beautiful idea. So here I'm just pointing to MakerDAO, particularly their coin DAI, which is just a beautiful idea of how do you build a stablecoin on top of an unstable asset. And there's a lot of science that goes into this, which is, again, is something that we talk about at length in the class. So this is, again, just beautiful sort of ideas. I wish I had more time to talk about that, but I want to talk about other things in the time that we have together. And the other thing is that there's a large number of experiments going on. This is just from DeFi Pulse, the largest projects that have the most block value in them. If we step back a second and just reflect on what's happened in the last 12 years since Satoshi launched Bitcoin, it's really quite remarkable. I mean, it's really amazing. If you look at the numbers, the amount of money that these programs are managing, literally, these are like, if you think about this, these are like 600-line programs that are managing, $10 billion. I think it's an incredible success for the community. It's really quite beautiful that this has happened. But again, it's literally 600 lines of code. And the code is open source. Anyone can look at this code and study how it behaves. In fact, the way I learn about a project is typically by looking at the actual code that runs the project. And it's really quite remarkable. This code is not very complicated. It's not very, very long. And the whole point is actually to keep it simple so that we can actually get some confidence that it's properly managing the treasury that's in charge of managing. But really, that's what's happening here, right? I mean, it's relatively short programs are managing enormous amounts of assets. So quite impressive that this is happening. Okay, so I guess, again, there was a couple of topics that I wanted to talk about. But before we get to those topics, I did want to mention that we mentioned kind of the lending space. As you can see in this picture, that many of the top projects are actually lending projects that will lend people crypto funds. The issue is that currently most of these lending projects are basically issuing what are called fully collateralized loans. Yeah, so you have to provide some collateral, and then you can take a loan against that collateral. It functions very much like a mortgage, where someone can take a loan using their house as a collateral. In a similar way, this is how these lending protocols work. One of the most challenging areas of a blockchain that's kind of an up-and-coming area for much more work in the future is basically the issue of decentralized, uncollateralized loans, right? So somebody comes to a decentralized application and says, I want to borrow a certain amount of funds, and I have no collateral to back that up. should the application provide the loan or not, building an application that makes those decisions correctly is turned out to be quite difficult. There are a number of projects now that are trying to do that. And again, I would really encourage you to kind of take a look at these projects, because this is really one of the cornerstones of what still needs to be done in the space. Whoever kind of solves the uncollateralized loan problem in a good way is going to do quite well. Yeah, so there are a number of projects in the space right now. What I did want to mention is why this problem is so difficult. Well, the problem is, how do you make a decision based on an address, like an Ethereum address is asking for a loan? How do you make a decision whether that loan should be granted or not? More importantly, if the person taking the loan defaults on the loan, what do we do about that, right? So we need some sort of a global notion of identity, in a sense that if an address defaults on a loan, something has to be done to prevent the owner of that address as just creating a new address and asking for a loan again and defaulting on that loan again. Yeah, so there needs to be some sort of a physical connection to physical identity that prevents someone from just coming back over and over and over again, pretending to be someone new every time and defaulting on those loans that they're getting. And similarly, there needs to be some sort of a legal regime that if someone defaults on a loan, there are some real-world consequences to that default. So in some countries, maybe this is doable, and maybe maybe in the West, where their identities, or maybe in developing economies, I should say, where identities and a legal regime is well developed, maybe that's where these uncollateralized loan systems will begin. But the goal, of course, is to make this all global, so anyone in the world can apply for an uncollateralized loan. And the question is, again, in an environment where there is not a strong notion of identity and there isn't a global regime, how do we decide when do we approve a loan or not? This is, to me, this is still kind of a hard, I'd say, a hard open problem. As I said, there are a number of experiments in play, and it's going to be really interesting to see, to see who actually controls this market at the end. But this is definitely an area for much future research and much future work. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about really is kind of two topics that are sort of always hot in the area of blockchains, which is scalability and interoperability. Interoperability basically means that today we have multiple blockchains that are sort of operating in silos, and yet the public would like to be able to interoperate between those blockchains, and the question is, what do we do about that? But let's start with scalability. Okay, so scalability is a beautiful, beautiful topic. We could do an entire course just on scalability. So, but here I only have a few minutes. So let me kind of just zoom in on the part of scalability that I really enjoy talking about. Okay, so what is the problem? Of course, as you know, both, for example, Bitcoin and Ethereum have relatively slow transaction rate, right? So Bitcoin can process 5 to 10 transactions a second. Ethereum can process 20 to 30 transactions a second. What's even more disturbing is that transaction fees are actually quite high. Yeah, so in times of concentration, transaction fees can actually go up as high as $100 for a simple transaction, and this is really harming the ecosystem. Right, it's really making it quite difficult to deploy dApps, where literally every single call to the dApp is going to cost the caller, many tens of dollars. We'd like to do something better. Of course, if you compare this to the Visa network is much faster. Transactions fees are non-trivial in the Visa network, but they don't operate like they do operate in the existing blockchains. So the question is, can we do better, right? Can we scale the blockchain to Visa speeds and do so with very low transaction fees? So there are many beautiful approaches. This is not a new problem. There are many. This has been a question now for many years, and there are many, many, many beautiful ideas that have come up. The first thing that comes to mind is just, let's design systems that have faster consensus, right? So maybe the consensus mechanism itself can handle tens of thousands of transactions a second, and we see actually modern blockchains that actually do this. I listed a few here, but there are many, many others that can actually scale the consensus mechanism to tens of thousands of transactions a second. So this is definitely one way to go, but we still love the existing systems that are out there, like Ethereum and all the others. Can we scale those up? So again, in the area of Bitcoin, one beautiful idea that has emerged is the idea of payment channels, where in fact most of the transactions happen off-chain. Basically, if I want to pay Pax, I wouldn't pay Pax through the chain, we would just basically talk to one another using a peer-to-peer method. The standard way to do this is using Lightning, the Lightning system. And I hope you're following recent news, but actually the news out of Sri Lanka is really quite interesting in that in Sri Lanka, they decided to make Bitcoin legal tender. I assume that in the future, they'll make other coins legal tender as well. But right now, Bitcoin is considered or is about to become legal tender in Sri Lanka. But if you're going to run a national economy on top of Bitcoin, you have to scale up the system. And Lightning is sort of the way to scale it up. There are wallets, Bitcoin wallets, that natively support payment channels through Lightning. The Strike wallet is an example. And those are going to be used, those are likely going to be used quite heavily in Sri Lanka. And in fact, you've probably been if you're following the news, you're probably seeing that the Lightning network is getting considerably more use now than it did before. What is it? They're up to 25,000 nodes at this point, which is remarkable. Yeah, which is wonderful to see this taking off. And again, if you're going to build a national economy with Bitcoin as a legal tender, you have to do something like payment channels. So it's not too surprising that Lightning is taking off. And I expect that if this experiment in Sri Lanka succeeds and maybe expands to other countries, I would expect payment channels to even grow further in size. So then moving on to the more programmable blockchains, the other approaches are the layer 2 approaches, things like rollup, optimistic rollup, where the idea is to batch many transactions into a single transaction. And actually, this is what I want to focus on. Yeah, so for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about rollup approaches just because they're so pretty and I really love describing them. And then, of course, there are many other ideas that have been out there, like scaling is such a hot topic, it's such an important topic that there are many, many experiments taking place. But let's zoom in and talk a little bit about the rollup approaches and how they work. Okay, so there are kind of fundamentally two rollup techniques. One is called ZK and one is called optimistic. I'm going to focus mostly on the ZK one, but most of what I say is going to apply to the optimistic methods as well. Okay, so what is the idea behind rollup? I wish I can kind of ask the audience, like, how many of you are familiar with rollup, and how many would like me to go into give an overview? But so I'll take a middle ground. I'll quickly explain what rollup is, and then we'll get to the more interesting parts of rollup. All right, so today basically, when you post a transaction to or a block of transactions to the blockchain, today the way the system works is fairly inefficient. Yeah, if we have a number of hundreds of miners or maybe thousands of miners running the system, all of them have to verify all the transactions in the block. Yeah, so one miner gets to mint a block containing many transactions, and then everybody in the ecosystem has to go and verify that the block is valid. So there's a lot of repeated work that's taking place today, and obviously that's wasted effort. It'd be nice if just one person can validate and everybody else can just verify that they did their job correctly. And that's kind of the idea behind rollup. What we're going to do is we're going to introduce what's called a rollup coordinator. And instead of people sending their transactions directly to the blockchain, what they'll do is they'll send their transactions to the rollup coordinator. The rollup coordinator, what it will do is it will batch all these transactions into a single rollup update block, very short rollup update block. But more importantly, the rollup coordinator is the one that's going to verify all the transactions, that everything is properly signed, that the account balances are correct, and so on. So it does all the heavy work of verifying the transactions, and then it's going to produce a very short proof that all these transactions are valid. Yeah, and this is kind of where the magic is. This is done using something called a SNARK, a succinct non-interactive argument, which allows you to very efficiently, or rather create a very short proof that all the transactions are valid, and verifying that proof is also very, very simple, right? So literally, you can take thousands of transactions, compress them into a single commitment, and provide a proof that commitment represents a valid set of transactions, and anyone can very easily verify that those transactions are all correct. So we send this proof to the blockchain along with a summary of all the transactions. We'll see why we have to send a summary in just a minute. And then now what the validators do, or what the miners do, is rather than verify the transactions themselves, all they do is they verify the proof. And again, as I said, verifying the proof is much, much, much easier than verifying the transactions. By the way, this also saves a lot of space on the blockchain, because this transaction summary doesn't include any of the digital signatures. And in fact, digital signatures are a big chunk of transaction data. All that can be removed, and what actually gets stored on the blockchain is just a proof and just a summary of the transactions without the digital signatures. So not only are we reducing work for the verifiers, we're also saving a lot of space on the blockchain by doing this. Okay, so that's the idea of Rollup. And again, there's two ways to do it. In the ZK Rollup, basically the coordinator provides a proof that transactions are valid. In the optimistic Rollup, there is no proof, and instead there is a mechanism by which anyone can complain that an update message from the coordinator was invalid, and then things can get rolled back. Yeah, so those are two different methods for doing this batch processing of transactions. But at a high level, the idea is to just batch a lot of transactions using the coordinator. So I'm going to focus on the ZK version, just because I love these snark proofs. A lot of our research is focused on snark proofs, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more about how they work. Okay, so yeah, as I say here, basically the coordinator is compressing thousands of transactions into a single on-chain proof, which just everyone verifies. Okay, so just to kind of explain in a bit more detail how this works, let's walk through an example. So here we have the coordinator. The coordinator is managing accounts for many, many different users, and every user has a balance which the coordinator actually knows. All right, so that's kind of the setup. The coordinators knows exactly who the users are, what their balances are. The coordinator is going to create a Merkle root of all these account balances. If you don't know what a Merkle tree is, don't worry about it. It's not important. What's important to know is this is just a way to commit to the current state of all the accounts. Okay, so the coordinator creates sort of a very short commitment to the state of all the accounts, and then pushes that commitment, that root. It's a very short root, just 32 bytes, that gets pushed onto the layer 1 blockchain. All right, so we write to a particular block, just 32 bytes, and that already commits the coordinator to the entire view of this layer 2 network. Okay, the next thing that happens is users want to transact. So we have our friends here, and say Alice says, I want to send 2 ETH to Bob, and here is my signature to say that I'm approving this transaction. Yeah. Bob says, I want to do an atomic swap with Zoe, right? So I want to send 1 ETH to Zoe, and she's going to send me 2 bats back. Yeah, and here's my signature on this transaction, and here's Zoe's signature on this transaction, right? So this is a way to execute an atomic swap using the coordinator, using a rollup. And then, whoever, let's say this is Carol, she submits her transaction as well. So everybody submits their transactions to the coordinator. What the coordinator does is it checks that all the signatures are valid. Then it goes ahead and updates everybody's account balances. Okay, so you see Alice paid Bob 2 ETH. And so let's see, so Alice's ETH count should go down to only 1 ETH, right? And so the coordinator updates everybody's balances. You can see Alice now only has 1 ETH, and everybody else's balances were updated as well. The coordinator now computes the new Merkle root of the current state of the world. This can be done actually fairly efficiently, all right? So we can compute a new commitment to everybody's balances, and then the coordinator pushes this new commitment onto the blockchain along with the transaction data, transaction summary, and along with a proof that the transition from the hash 354, the hash in block 354 to the hash in block 357, that transition was valid. All right, so what the snark proof is actually proving is that the transition from the old Merkle tree to the new Merkle tree is proper and done, right? So everybody's transactions were signed, everybody had enough balances in their account to support their transaction, and so on. Okay? So this is how we move from one state of the world to the next state of the world by simply pushing a very short commitment to the blockchain, right? So the 32-byte commitment in block 354, 32-byte commitment in block 357, and we're committing to millions of accounts here. Yeah, that's kind of the amazing thing. And the transition, the blockchain, the layer 1 blockchain can verify that the transition is valid simply by checking this very short proof. Yeah, and the amazing thing, this really is mind-blowing, is that you can verify that the transition is correct. Even though there are thousands of transactions in this transition, you can verify that the transition is correct simply by verifying a very simple smart proof. Yeah, and that takes constant work, so very little work for the miners to actually verify the transition is correct. So A, we save space in the blockchain, and B, we save a lot of work for the miners because they just verify a simple proof. They don't actually verify the batch of transactions. Okay, so that's the idea behind ZK Rollup, and now there's a lot of interesting details. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the details. So first of all, you see that transactions within a single rollup system, basically if Alice wants to pay Bob and both of them are on the same rollup system, that's actually really easy. That's exactly what Rollup is designed to do. And settlement of this transaction is done on the L1 network, right? As soon as the Rollup, the coordinator pushes the state update to the L1 network, the transaction is done. Very fast, very simple settlement of transactions. Now, you could imagine there will be multiple rollup systems out there. In fact, we already have multiple rollup systems deployed. And so if one rollup system, suppose I have an account on one rollup system and my friend has an account on a different rollup system, how do I pay my friend? So the naive way to do it is basically to have me move my funds to Ethereum, so out of the rollup system onto the layer 1 network. And then from Ethereum, I would move the funds to my friend's rollup system. Yeah, so I have to go in sort of a V direction where I have to move from L2 to L1 and then from L1 to L2. As I say in the second bullet here, moving funds from a rollup system back onto Ethereum, back onto the L1, is actually much more expensive because this is not handled within the batch. In fact, now the coordinator has to issue an Ethereum transaction that moves funds from the coordinator's account into my account. Okay, so this is actually much more expensive than simple rollup to rollup. Rollup to L1 requires additional work on the L1 network, so we get higher transaction fees as a result. So again, going back to the case where I wanted to move funds from one rollup system to a different rollup system, if I did this through the layer 1 network, that would be quite expensive. And so what's interesting is there's actually a lot of work now on how do we actually transition funds directly from one layer 2 network to another layer 2 network without actually touching the layer 1 network. Yeah, and that's actually done through bridging mechanisms, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But the whole interoperability question, it's really interesting that typically when we think of interoperability, we think about interoperability between, say, Ethereum and Bitcoin or Ethereum and Polkadot, like interoperability between layer 1 networks. But there's also a very interesting question around interoperability between layer 2 networks. And again, there are projects that are specifically designed to address layer 2 to layer 2 transfers. Okay, so that's one issue, basically transferring assets within rollup systems or among a rollup or inside a rollup system and so on. Another issue is basically how do we migrate projects from a layer 1 network like Ethereum to run on a layer 2 rollup systems. So one very interesting and exciting development that's like about to be deployed is what's called a ZKEVM, zero knowledge EVM. One example is the one developed by Matter Labs, but other companies are working on this as well. So the ZKEVM, to me, honestly, is a surprise, right? This is something that we thought would be very difficult and would take many, many, many years to develop something that actually works. Well, what the community showed is that, in fact, running zero knowledge proofs on an entire Solidity contract actually is doable and, in fact, quite practical. Yeah, so what ZKEVM does is basically provides a Solidity compatibility to the picture that we just showed, right? So the picture we showed basically showed very simple transactions between members of a rollup system. But more generally, we'd like to run Solidity programs, right? We'd like to run dApps on top of a coordinator, which would mean that the coordinator now has to produce proofs that a Solidity program ran correctly. And how do you prove that? How do you prove that the execution path, the complete execution path of an entire Solidity program? That is actually seems quite difficult, but in fact now is getting. Not only is it getting deployed, it seems actually quite practical and ready for use. So this is a pretty exciting development, I think, for ZK rollup systems. So we're going to see this in a lot of different ZK rollup systems, not just Matter Labs. I think there are going to be a number of them that deploy these kind of systems. And the beauty of this is it makes it actually quite easy to migrate applications from that are currently running on Ethereum to basically run on top of a rollup. And as a result, the layer 1 system, Ethereum, for example, Ethereum, would primarily be responsible for settlement, so that most of the work that it would do would just be verifying snark proofs and keeping track of the root commitment that the rollup system sends on to the Ethereum network. Yeah, so this is a pretty exciting development, would allow us to run dApps on layer 2 at a much lower rate, at a much lower transaction fee rate. What I would say, though, again, just to be complete, I would say that the optimistic methods, optimistic rollup, actually already supports compatibility with the EVM. So migrating from the level 1 Ethereum to the layer 2 optimistic rollup is already quite easy. Yeah, and so we already have that. So why do we need a ZKEVM? And the answer is that transaction finality is a little bit, or rather, the speed at which finality happens is a little bit easier with these proofs, right? As soon as you verify the proof, the transactions are basically finalized. Yeah, so there's interesting developments in this space, and that's kind of where we are. So I hope this was clear. It's kind of, to me, this is like an amazing development that's happening in the space. Just to see this being deployed, the fact that ZKEVMs are possible is remarkable, and I'm really happy to see this actually getting used. The last thing I want to talk about rollups is the sphere of centralization. Yeah, so you should be asking yourself, well, what did we just do here? So this coordinator sounds like it's a central entity. It's a single point of failure. And so it naively might introduce some centralization fears. But the answer is that no, the rollup server is actually not, the coordinator is not actually a single point of failure. In fact, if the coordinator fails, let's say it just dies and stops working, it's not the end of the world. The idea would be that the users will simply find a different coordinator that's able to produce proofs and push them onto the network. Yeah, so it certainly can't cheat, because the coordinator cannot cheat because it can't produce proofs if it tries to do invalid transactions. And even if it dies, it's not the end of the world. Users can simply use a different coordinator that will produce proofs. There's one wrinkle, which is if the coordinator dies and we need to start a new coordinator, somehow this new coordinator needs to get all the current account information, in order to be able to produce proofs. And the question is, how do we get the current account information if the coordinator we're currently using is dead and no longer responds? And so there are two solutions to this. I'm going to use the name that Matter Labs used here, but there are many names to these, and different systems give these solutions different names. I'm just going to call them ZK Sync and ZK Porter. These are two different solutions for enabling a new coordinator to come in if the existing coordinator stops working. Yeah, and both of these work concurrently. So what is ZK Sync and ZK Porter? So the idea in ZK Sync is basically what we saw so far, where basically all the transaction data, so a summary of all the transactions, is stored on the Ethereum network, right? So the layer 1 chain basically will accept a batch of transactions only if that batch contains transaction summaries, and those transaction summaries are consistent with the proof that was submitted to the layer 1 network. Okay, so basically, since all transaction data now is stored on the layer 1 network on Ethereum, the new coordinator can simply run through all these transactions, construct the latest states, and take over from the old coordinator. So that works perfectly fine, and in fact, that's traditionally what's called a rollup system. The only problem is this introduces higher Ethereum transaction fees, because we're storing all this transaction data on the Ethereum network itself. Yeah, so even though it's stored as call data, there are still fees associated with storing this data on the Ethereum network. So ZK Porter is basically another idea, which is a way to reduce those transaction fees. And the idea is basically to introduce a secondary blockchain. Yeah, this is a proof of stake style blockchains, where all this transaction data will be stored on the secondary blockchain. Yeah, and again, the L1 network will accept transaction only if the secondary blockchain says that it has all the transaction data. Okay, so again, this is, as I said, maintained by staked coordinator. We now have cheap off-chain storage, right? We just store it somewhere else by these other backup systems, backup servers. And then if the coordinator that we're using dies, we can simply go to this other blockchain, recover all the transaction data, reconstruct the current states, and start a new coordinator to get it to do whatever we need to do. Okay, so basically, this provides cheap off-chain storage. It doesn't have the same guarantees as ZK Sync because the data is not actually on Ethereum. But the beauty of this is that it's up to the user to decide how do you want the account managed. Do you want the account managed on ZK Sync, where you have stronger guarantees but higher fees, or do you want it on ZK Porter, where you have much lower fees, but now you have to trust these other coordinators to make sure that they maintain all transaction data. So it's up to the user to decide how to do this, which is kind of cool. All right, so this is all I wanted to say about Rollup. I'll just say that it's an amazing application of cryptographic proof systems. One might wonder about privacy, because as I described the system today, the coordinator sees all the transactions in the clear. So there's a question of whether we can actually hide transactions for the coordinator, and it turns out using, again, clever zero-knowledge techniques, something called ZK Rollup, it turns out it's not that hard to hide transactions from the coordinator. So we can even build this whole system and provide privacy, potentially compliant privacy to end users. Yeah, and there's lots of research, including the research in my own group, on making these proof systems as best as possible for a Rollup like system. Okay, so this is all I wanted to say about Rollup. Sorry, I really like talking about this. This is such a beautiful idea that I really enjoy describing how it works. I did want to talk about interoperability, but I see that we're running a little bit low on time. So I did want to leave a few minutes for questions. So in the interest of leaving time for questions, maybe I'll just say that interoperability is primarily done through bridges, by building proper bridges. Maybe I'll just mention that here. Let's see if I can jump. No, I can't jump. So I'll just run through what I had to say here. This will all be covered in the class. So if any of you want to hear this, you're very welcome to join the class. I'll just say that when it comes to interoperability, one design that seems to be quite promising is a star network, where we have all the wonderful blockchains that have been developed, and then there is a network being formed called the Axelar network that actually allows any smart contract on any one of these chains. So an Ethereum smart contract can make a call to the Solana smart contract on Solana. The smart contract can respond. You can even chain calls, and all that is done through the Axelar network. It's kind of an elegant design in how this works, and so hopefully this interoperability problem will be solved too by correct use of bridges and bridging networks like this. But sadly, I'm out of time, so I think I'll touch on one last topic and then I'll stop. So so in terms of final thoughts, there's a lot of discussion right now on about central bank digital currencies. In particularly, I'm sure all of you are aware that China is kind of leading the role here. They themselves deployed a central bank digital currency. This is not what we would call a blockchain. It's not what we would call a cryptocurrency. It's basically more of a centralized system where the central bank holds everybody's accounts and people transact on those accounts. So, of course, with that design, there are concerns about privacy, that the central bank sees a lot of transactions, questions of interoperability with other central banks who might want to deploy a central bank digital currency, questions about censorship, questions about world power, and so on. So, in fact, we at Stanford are putting a very large report on the Chinese CBDC. So it was very interesting to kind of dive deeply into what's being built there and what are the global implications of this. I hope the report will be ready in about a month, and so I encourage you to read it. It'll be very detailed and go into a lot of the technical and political questions around this system. The one thing that I wanted to talk about is, what should countries in the West do? In particular, what should the U.S. central bank do? Should it also provide its own digital currency? And again, people have lots of different opinions about this. My personal opinion is that this is kind of not how things work in the U.S. in the sense that in the US, we let private industry drive technology, and the government's role is more and just to make sure no harm is being done, ideally. And so there are actually lots of companies in the blockchain ecosystem who can, without too much work, step up and provide the technical capabilities for building something like a US central bank digital currency. And so the hope is that by working with the blockchain ecosystem and actually with the community at large, we can do something similar in the US. So I think I'll stop here. And I'm very, very happy to take any questions that anybody has. So thank you so much for sticking around, and I look forward to seeing you in one of these future events. And yeah, now we can turn it on to Q&A. So Pat,
thanks, Dan.
I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, great, thank you, Dan. That was amazing. I thought maybe it might be worth staying a little bit longer and starting with questions on the Rollups, because you spent some time on that. I think you addressed it in your issue, but if you could just go over it in your discussion, if you could go over it in a little bit more detail, there was some confusion about how a rollup wasn't a new centralized system. Do you need to trust the person or the entity that's doing the rollup? How is it distinct from a centralized system?
No, I think that's a wonderful question. So in some sense, we're sending our transactions to the coordinator. The coordinator then, one might worry that the coordinator is a centralized party. So first of all, it's very important to understand that the coordinator is not trusted in a sense that it cannot cheat, right? It will only be able to issue an acceptable proof if all the transactions it received are properly signed and all of them are valid transactions. Yeah, so it simply cannot create a fake proof. That's because of the security of the proof system. And so it can't cheat. But what it can do is, for example, refuse to accept transactions from somebody, right? Or it could go offline altogether. The interesting thing there is that there's no reason why there's only one coordinator. You could have multiple coordinators, as long as they all agree on the current state of the world. Basically, that you can send your transactions to any coordinator that you'd like, and if any one of the coordinators accepts your transactions, then the transaction will get included in a batch of transactions, which will then get posted onto the blockchain. Yeah. So we don't need to worry so much about cheating, because that's not possible. And in terms of censorship or just denial of service, the reason this works is because these systems are designed to have multiple coordinators active at any given time. And this is exactly why it was so important to have transaction data available to all these coordinators. And I mentioned two different ways to store the transaction data, either on-chain or off-chain, and both of those have their consequences to both, right? Higher transaction fees for one, but higher guarantees with those higher transaction fees. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for asking.
I think maybe we could stick with a few higher level given time. And so one question that maybe is related to that is, can you comment on the relationship? You mentioned denial of service attacks on the coordinator. Can you comment a little bit more on the relationship between cryptocurrencies and the availability and integrity of the network infrastructure more generally? What is the relationship between those two?
And the network, you mean so the question is about the decentralized network infrastructure.
Yes.
Presumably, right? Yeah. So we're sort of asking about security of the consensus layer. That's really where the question is headed. And again, the consensus layer is designed to operate as long as 51% of the participants are honest. So if there's a network partition, right, that because of a network attack or an outage, then there are issues, right? The network will have trouble accepting new transactions. So what can I say? I mean, so the security of the system just depends on decentralization. There's no doubt there, right? We need to have 51% honest parties. There's actually a fair amount of work, even at the networking layer, to make sure that miners are properly connected and that they're connected over sufficiently fast links. So you have to remember, these systems have only been around for a decade, and already seeing the amount of infrastructure that's being built to support these systems is truly remarkable, right? So the fact that there are now, there are additional networks that are being built just to provide connectivity between miners these are overlay networks. Yeah, it's wonderful to see, right? So it all guarantees, it all goes basically back to guaranteeing that the network remains up. One thing that I should say is, in some sense, because of the consensus protocols that are needed for decentralization, not by design, but because of these consensus protocols, these blockchain systems have an extremely high uptime, yeah, compared to like just traditional cloud services that have outages from time to time. We see that these the blockchain networks generally, they're very reliable. As long as enough miners are up, the system works, and so we get reliability actually almost as a consequence of the consensus protocols that we have. So yeah, I think that's all I'll say about that. So thanks for the question.
That's great. And maybe that you've already covered this, but related to what you were just mentioning is how common is a 51% attack, or is that something that people anticipate, and what do you do in response to that? So I guess this is a situation where you don't have 51% of the miners who are honest.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess we've already seen some examples of 51% attacks on these smaller networks, at least. Yeah. So look, it can't. That's an assumption. That's an assumption that's built into the system. I think the good news is that there are proper incentives in place to make sure these systems continue to operate correctly, right? So the miners, either they invested heavily in hardware, or they're going to be staked heavily in a proof of stake system, or they invested heavily in disks in a proof of space system like Chia. So that the miners themselves are quite heavily incentivized to make sure the system operates correctly. And really, if you think about it, at the end of the day, security and proper operation of a system often is tied back to incentives. And here, the good news, because the way incentives were set up properly, we see this, that we could come close to a 51% attack, and then people back away from it, because they don't want to harm the overall operation of the system. So, and that's why this works. Just the incentives are aligned with everyone, making sure the system works correctly.
I think we're just about at time. So Dan, maybe one last question that's come up a couple times is just the relationship between blockchain and sort of environmental concerns and energy use. Has there been any work in that space? Do you have any thoughts on that?
A lot of work, yes. So right. So I guess this comes up all the time too. You have to remember that Bitcoin was the very first blockchain that came out, and that used proof of work, which is not environmentally friendly. Ethereum came after, also used proof of work, which is not environmentally friendly. The good news is that we know what to do, right? The new blockchains that are being developed are much more environmentally friendly, right? They're based on proof of stake. They're based on proof of space. Ethereum already announced plans to move to a proof of stake system. And so it's quite interesting that moving forward, most of the common blockchains are going to be proof of stake, which simply doesn't have environmental concerns. For Bitcoin, it's actually quite interesting. This is kind of a challenge for the future, I think, in that we might end up in a world where the majority of blockchains are environmentally friendly, either proof of stake or proof of space, but the Bitcoin-like systems, which are probably not going to be changing, right? One of the nice things about Bitcoin is, you know what it is, and it's going to be like that for a while. That's probably going to keep on being a proof of work. And so you can think for yourself, what are the implications where we have an ecosystem that is environmentally friendly with one blockchain not being environmentally friendly? It's kind of interesting to think about what would happen in that environment, but it sounds like that's actually where things are headed. It's a good question. And but the good news is the community is aware of this. There's a very good answer. That's where things are going. So things will be much more environmentally friendly moving forward.
Thank you so much for your time, Dan. I know we ran a little bit over, and thank you everyone for joining us. That was wonderful. We didn't get to all the questions, but we appreciate you participating. So thank you, everyone.
This is great. Thank you all.